Well, the inflation numbers dropped, of course, 1 hour ago, and markets just opened 4.5 minutes ago. The S&P and NASDAQ have hit record highs on this inflation report that showed inflation at 3.4%. The estimates were for 3.5%. Aaron Hedlund with the Show Me Institute is here on KCMO. Aaron, what do you read into that inflation report that came down last hour, my man?
Well, first of all, great to join you. And, I mean, it's certainly good news. Unfortunately, it's just one data point after several months of bad data points. So I don't think it's sort of predicts a whole lot about what the Fed will do. But I think the key number that the markets are reacting positively to is that the monthly inflation number was flat. So if we can stay at that, then over time, we'll get closer to the Fed's 2% target.
So they're more reacting to inflation month over month being zero, being unchanged.
Exactly. Because if we look over the course of the whole year, that's incorporating some bad months and some mediocre months and now a good month. And it's really this good month that markets are reacting positively to. But again, it's tough to project that forward. We don't know if next month's going to be the same or the month after that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then how much of that, too, is just we have had a decrease in gas prices over the last 2-3 weeks or so. Some of that driven by the release of oil reserves. So, I mean, I don't want to say the number's artificial, but how much of that needs to be factored into the equation?
Considerably. So this is why the Fed focuses more on core inflation. Core inflation is basically you strip out food and energy because they see those factors as being driven by things that the Fed has very little control over. So when you strip that out and you look at that core number, it rose 0.2% in the month, which if you multiply that by 12 is still above 2. So that wasn't a bad number, but it certainly wasn't as rosy as the flat would look like.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we had some people calling this morning after the inflation report dropped, and one guy in particular stood out to me where he's in the construction industry, and he said in the last 2-3 weeks he's seen product increase 10 to 20%. In part, what he's being told is because of new trade wars that are taking place, specifically with China. What do you make of that? How big of a concern is that, and how should that be factored into the conversation here about the economy at large?
So, I haven't specifically dived into the materials numbers, but I haven't seen anything to indicate like a rapid increase in recent months. Mm-hmm. As far as trade with China goes, I mean, it's a complicated issue because China is not just some benevolent other country that's trying to trade on the world stage. They are actively using their position and their size and their population size to try to change the rules of the game. So, trade wars sound like a scary thing, but the reality is they're fighting the war no matter what. The question is, what can we do to make sure that we're insulated from the bad decisions that they're doing?
So the Fed's talking later today, and, I think the market in part may be reacting to hopes that the Fed could start cutting rates sooner than what might have been expected here in the last few weeks. Is that basically in part what the reaction is? And what do you think the Fed, I guess it's really two questions. What do you think the Fed will do? And then what should the Fed do?
Well, first of all, I think it's delusional to think that the Fed is going to cut rates today. I just don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I'll mea culpa if I'm wrong on that, but I really don't think they're going to cut rates right now. I think what markets are, the rational actors in the markets are really looking several months down the road. They're thinking, okay, this is the first good inflation report we've seen in a while. Maybe that means the rate cuts are at least going to happen sometime this year because people were starting to doubt that. I mean, if you rewind the clock 4 or 5 months, we were thinking there'd be 6 rate cuts. I wasn't thinking that, but the markets were. And then it really got to the point where maybe there'll be 0. Now they're thinking, okay, rate cuts are coming, probably not today, though. And then it shouldn't come today either.
What's the earliest you think anything could come? September?
I think that's probably what markets are looking at, and I think that's a plausible scenario. If we have consistently good inflation reports between now and September, then I could see a potential rate cut happening then.
How concerned would you be? It would look very political to start cutting rates. If you're going to, do September, why not just wait till post-election?
Yeah, so I mean, historically speaking, the Fed has cut and raised rates during election years. I mean, they really stick to the script and saying that they don't have politics involved in that. What I would say, though, practically speaking, is it just means the data has to be really, really clear. So, I mean, if you got inflation numbers like today, where it's literally flat, and you had that all the way from now until September, I think the Fed could come out and say, all right, we're cutting rates and not be accused as much because the data was just so strongly in favor of it. But if you get numbers that are kind of bouncing up and down and that just being a little bit ambiguous, then I think that political criticism becomes a lot stronger.
Mm-hmm. Aaron Hedlund with the Show Me Institutes on KCMO Talk Radio. The inflation number comes in at 3.4%. Expectations were for 3.5%. I mean, what about the Fed target of 2%? I mean, you're still 65 to 75% above where you want inflation to be if you're Jerome Powell. So why is this rate cut thing even a conversation when people have been getting soaked the last 3-4 years?
I mean, for months, I've been saying the notion that there'd be a bunch of rate cuts this year didn't make any sense. I mean, the Fed has said their target's 2%, so you have to actually show that you're getting down to target. And that's why if they were to cut rates today, that would be nuts. I mean, inflation is not anywhere close to 2%.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, if you have several months of very low inflation, then that number will get much closer to 2%. But absolutely, I mean, one of the lessons from the late 70s and early 80s, and not just in the United States, but central banks around the world, is that the number one currency, besides the actual currency that's circulating in the economy, that they need to maintain is their credibility. So when the Fed talks about 2%, they can't suddenly kind of abandon ship before the plane's actually on the runway.
Yeah, but I mean, there's no way we're going to be at 2% by September or by, end of the summer. I don't see how that's at all possible for a year-over-year number. But listen, I guess I'm happy to be surprised. But the labor market is still so strong, and that is good. I want the labor market to be strong. We all should. But it also probably signals that you're not going to get that number down because people are spending money, partially because they have to, right?
Yeah, I mean, and to be clear, I am not forecasting a rate cut in September. I think that's the earliest possible scenario if all the stars aligned and inflation was super low all the way until then.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really expect that to happen. And there are indeed other data points that should be concerning to the Fed when it comes to inflation. So that's why my mind would be blown if they cut rates today.
All right. Aaron Hedlund, good work with the Show Me Institute. Thank you, sir. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me on.